There is a reason this story is usually told vaguely, with softened language and missing numbers, because once you say it plainly, once you admit that doctors across Europe and the United States spent decades deliberately dosing patients with mercury, sometimes until their teeth fell out and their minds unraveled, it stops sounding like a misunderstanding and starts sounding like something people should have stopped much earlier. And that realization tends to make people uncomfortable in a way that encourages distance rather than curiosity. What makes that discomfort harder to escape is that this was not fringe medicine or folk healing practiced on the edges of society, but an officially sanctioned cure taught in medical schools, written into military manuals, and prescribed by men whose names still appear in textbooks for their contributions to modern medicine. Which means this was not ignorance operating in isolation, but confidence operating at scale. The cure had a clean, reassuring name, calomel, a white powder made from mercury chloride, and it was trusted enough to be given to children, soldiers, prisoners, and the poor, often in escalating doses. Because the belief at the center of medicine at the time was not that the body needed gentle support, but that it needed to be pushed, purged, and forced back into balance, and that belief carried enormous authority. By the time doubts became loud enough to leave a paper trail, thousands were already dead, many more permanently damaged, and the system that enabled it had already begun moving on, leaving behind clinical notes that read like routine care even as the outcomes bordered on catastrophic, which makes it difficult not to wonder how many people lived through this without ever realizing what had actually been done to them. Welcome to They Actually Did This, where history does not shout its strangest moments, but records them calmly, files them away, and waits for someone to notice how unbelievable they really are. We created this channel because some of the most unsettling things humans have done were not crimes or accidents in the way we like to imagine them, but decisions made inside institutions by people who believed they were acting responsibly, ethically, and in accordance with the best knowledge available to them at the time. This story belongs squarely in that category, because it is not about a single bad actor or a hidden conspiracy, but about a system doing what it believed was correct for so long that stopping began to feel more dangerous than continuing. To understand why people did not immediately resist mercury treatment, you have to understand that illness already came with an expectation of suffering, and that medical care was not associated with comfort in the way we think of it today, but with endurance. When calomel was prescribed for fevers, dysentery, yellow fever, or syphilis, patients were warned that the body would resist, that the medicine would provoke violent reactions, and that those reactions were not signs of danger but signs of engagement, proof that the disease was being driven out by force rather than persuasion. So when excessive salivation began, sometimes soaking linens and floors, when gums swelled and ulcerated, when teeth loosened and fell out, patients were told this was mercurialization, a desired state that meant the cure had reached the bloodstream and was doing its work. Children treated for simple fevers, prisoners treated for gastrointestinal illness, soldiers treated for tropical disease, all followed the same script, suffering framed as progress, pain framed as purpose, which meant that the first moment something felt wrong rarely arrived during the worst of the treatment, but afterward, when recovery never came. That was when tremors lingered, when speech slowed, when memory dulled, when the body failed to return to itself, and when patients began to sense, often without language for it, that something irreversible had happened, even as doctors reassured them that time would resolve what the cure had stirred up. What eventually made the unease impossible to ignore was not a single dramatic case, because those could always be explained away, but repetition, the same physical collapse appearing across patients who had nothing else in common. In crowded hospitals, and especially in military wards, calomel was used aggressively because armies could not afford prolonged illness, and decisive treatment was valued over cautious observation, particularly during outbreaks of yellow fever, dysentery, and malaria in unsanitary forts across the southern United States and the Caribbean. United States Army surgeons administered mercury repeatedly, sometimes daily, believing strong purgatives were necessary to counter what they described as internal putrefaction, and over time the same symptoms appeared regardless of diagnosis: excessive drooling, neurological tremors, profound weakness, and slow wasting that followed treatment rather than preceded it. Letters home began to mention that men who avoided doctors sometimes survived, while those who followed treatment faithfully often did not, a realization that spread socially in taverns, churches, and correspondence long before it reached the language of formal medicine. Once people began watching the cure instead of the disease, denial became harder to maintain, because patterns have a way of eroding certainty without ever announcing themselves. The reason this pattern did not immediately stop the practice is that authority in medicine at the time was not distributed evenly, and questioning it came with professional and social risk. Physicians like Benjamin Rush were not peripheral figures, but central pillars of early American medicine, deeply respected, politically connected, and intellectually influential, and their endorsement carried more weight than dozens of troubling patient outcomes. Rush believed illness was caused by obstruction and imbalance, and that aggressive intervention restored order, a worldview reinforced by classical medical theory and personal conviction. And during the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, he prescribed calomel and bloodletting on a massive scale, convinced that hesitation was more dangerous than action. Younger physicians followed his methods, not because they were cruel or indifferent, but because deviation felt like professional self-sabotage in a young nation desperate to prove that it was modern, rational, and capable of controlling chaos. In that environment, uncertainty was interpreted as weakness, and confidence gradually replaced understanding, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish between belief and evidence. This story also cannot be separated from the broader reality people were already living in, because death was constant, intimate, and expected. Infant mortality was high, childbirth was dangerous, infectious disease moved quickly through households, and medical care was often sought only when fear outweighed hope, which meant that by the time a physician arrived, families wanted action rather than caution. Hospitals were overcrowded, prisons relied on physicians to keep inmates alive enough to work, and enslaved people were treated as medical subjects rather than patients, making aggressive experimentation easier to justify within a system that already devalued certain lives. In that world, a cure that visibly did something, even something violent, felt preferable to uncertainty, because uncertainty offered no structure, no narrative, and no reassurance that anyone was in control. Mercury did not appear extreme, it appeared purposeful. What makes this story crazier is that it was not unprecedented, even at the time. Medicine already had a long history of treatments that weakened patients in the name of balance, bloodletting being the most obvious example, defended for centuries despite mounting evidence of harm. Each generation believed it was improving upon the last, refining methods rather than repeating mistakes, even as the underlying logic remained unchanged, that suffering could be reclassified as therapeutic if it followed theory. The mercury cure inherited this mindset completely, and because it fit within an existing framework of belief, it did not feel like repetition. It felt like progress. There is no moment anyone later pointed to and said that was when it stopped, because the mercury cure did not end with an investigation or a reckoning, but with a gradual retreat disguised as evolution. As the 19th century progressed and explanations of disease shifted toward sanitation, contagion, and eventually microscopic organisms, calomel simply stopped fitting as neatly into the story medicine was telling itself. Prescriptions became less aggressive, then less frequent, then optional, until the cure quietly disappeared from routine care, not with ceremony, but with omission. For the people still suffering mercury's effects, this disappearance was deeply unsettling, because it meant the thing that had altered their bodies no longer even existed as something to argue against. There was no major announcement of an error. The cure did not fail publicly. It failed as quietly as a whisper. For survivors, life did not resume where it had left off, and that realization settled in slowly, over years rather than days. Hands that had once been steady developed tremors that made writing, eating, and working difficult or impossible, quietly ending livelihoods that depended on precision and strength, especially for laborers, craftsmen, and soldiers with no pensions and no rehabilitation. Speech slowed or became irregular, memory fractured, emotional control weakened, and identity shifted in a society that measured worth through productivity and restraint. Teeth lost to mercury poisoning did not return, and prosthetics were crude or inaccessible, leaving many survivors visibly marked by the cure. Their appearance altered in ways that invited judgment, pity, or avoidance. Many never fully understood what had happened to them, because physicians rarely named mercury as the cause of lasting harm, preferring explanations that placed responsibility back onto disease, age, or personal constitution. By the time mercury's damage could have been confronted openly, punishment had already slipped out of reach. Not because the harm was unclear, but because the system had never been designed to recognize this kind of failure as wrongdoing. Doctors had acted publicly, visibly, and in alignment with accepted practice, which in legal terms functioned as protection rather than liability. Mercury poisoning presented as a slow unraveling rather than a single, unmistakable injury, allowing responsibility to dissolve into ambiguity, and malpractice law barely existed in a form that could address harm caused by professional consensus. Courts deferred to medical authority, and punishing physicians would have required admitting that knowledge itself had failed, a destabilizing idea in societies that depended on expertise to maintain order. So harm became complication, death became inevitability, and survivors became unfortunate but unremarkable. No one went to jail because there was nowhere to put the blame without unraveling the structure itself. The absence of punishment was not an oversight. It was the system working exactly as it was designed to. What lingers after this story is not outrage so much as unease, because there is no villain to point to, and no moment where everything clearly went wrong. The doctors believed they were helping. The institutions believed they were being responsible. The patients had no reason to doubt them. This was not a secret experiment or a hidden crime. It happened in public, in hospitals, in official records, carried out by people who thought they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. This was real, and they actually did this.